Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here. Governor Dukakis, thanks so much for that very kind introduction. I did get my start in politics through the Dukakis campaigns of the early 1970s. I grew up outside of Boston, Wellesley. I think I carried my first political signs from McGovern at the age of 16 in 1972, and thank God Massachusetts had the foresight to be the only state to vote for McGovern, and then became involved in the governor's campaign in 1974 as a high school student. I told the governor I just barely made it today because I had to go to New York and come back. I went by Amtrak, by the Acela, and I think it took about 18 hours to get there. And I said, if Governor Dukakis had been elected president, we'd have high-speed rail in this country, including between Boston and New York. So I want to thank the governor. I also want to thank Barry Bluestone. Barry didn't even remember this. But I went to Boston College, great university, although we did lose to Northeastern 3-1 in Honduras on Saturday night. Unfortunately, and while I was at BC, I was told you've got to take a course with Barry Bluestone. I took his course my senior year. I loved it. And today I went up and I said, Professor, I took your course. He had no memory of me whatsoever. But that's what happens. You teach several thousand students over a course of a brilliant academic career. I'm happy to be with Steve. Steve and I met in Berlin when he was New York Times correspondent there, and I really admired his work. And frankly, I admired his intellectual courage, because he does call them like they are, tell it like it is, and he has the courage of his convictions when he writes. He's done some fabulous writing on Turkey, great writing, as the governor said, on Iran, is now at work. Are we allowed to say what book you're at work on a biography of John Foster Dulles and the Dulles brothers? Alan Dulles as well. So he is one of our great intellectual figures here in Boston. Honored to be with him. So what the governor and Professor Bluestone have asked us to do is to talk about the Middle East, a rather small, unassuming topic these days, maybe to frame it in the context of our political campaign. And how should we be thinking about the choices that Americans have to make as we look towards November 6th in our election? At least that's what I'll try to talk about. And I start by stepping back from the Middle East and just trying to answer one question very briefly. What does the international landscape look to Americans as we look to 2013 and January 20th, 2013, when either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney are going to raise their hand and say no to the Constitution? And what's that agenda look like? I'd say it's the most complex agenda that Americans have faced internationally in several generations. The most difficult and the most dangerous set of international challenges we've ever had, certainly in my lifetime. I'd say going back to the Second World War and the dawn of the nuclear age, as that war came to a close in the summer of 1945. And here's how I justify that big statement. I take you to the President's desk in the Oval Office on January 20th, 2013, and you've got, inboxes. One's domestic affairs. I'm not competent to take you through that. I've got my views, strong views, but it's not my field of expertise. But I know a little bit about foreign policy because I was a career diplomat in the Foreign Service, as the governor said, for a very long time. And my wife Libby is here tonight. We served in Mauritania, West Africa. We served in Cairo and Jerusalem in the 1980s, served in Greece and served at NATO, and a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And if I think about the inbox that President Obama or President Romney will face on January 20th, 2013, it's daunting, because the top issue there is the global recession. We're not out of it yet. No matter what the economists tell you, and talk to people just trying to pay their bills, talk to people who had their homes foreclosed, talk to young people, and we have 3 daughters in their 20s. How difficult is it for a BC, Northeastern, or Harvard graduate to walk out of our universities and try to get a job? A lot more difficult than when we were walking out of these universities a very long time ago. And our president is the global leader. And we still have the largest economy, the most innovative economy. We're the wealthiest country on earth. We've got to lead the world out of recession at a time when the Europeans are declining in productivity and Indian and Chinese growth rates are slowing. There's real cause for concern that we're not climbing out of this recession. And then, in fact, 2013 and 14 could be difficult years. That's issue number 1. What's behind the economy in terms of priority? The war in Afghanistan. And I've really been struck by how little discussion there has been in this campaign about the war, because it's the longest war in American history. And we still have 68,000 troops, men and women in uniform, serving there in a very hostile environment, fighting a very difficult foe, the Taliban, as well as the Haqqani network and Al-Qaeda and the other terrorist groups that go back and forth across the Pakistan-Afghan border in the eastern part of Afghanistan. This is a big challenge for us, because I think most people agree. If you look at President Obama's position, President Obama says we should come out, take the troops out by 2014, perhaps leave a small contingent of troops, not to patrol streets, but to just guard against the resurgence of Al-Qaeda and some of the other terrorist networks. Governor Romney's been a little less specific. He says he'll ask his generals. Important to ask generals. It's important to ask our military what we should do, but the buck stops at that desk in the Oval Office. And we do rely on our constitutional system, on civilian leaders to make these big decisions. Do we go to war or not, or do we stay at war? After 11 years. There's no conventional victory in sight, right? And so we're going to have to answer the question that General Petraeus asked a couple of years ago, how is this war going to end? And my guess is it will end at the negotiating table. In a very difficult set of negotiations with the Afghan government, the Taliban, the Pakistani government, that will look reminiscent to what, remember how the Vietnam War ended in the peace talks that took, I think, 5 years between 1968 and 1973. So that's issue number 2. What are we going to do about Afghanistan and redeem the sacrifice that our soldiers have made since, the month after 9/11, when we went into Afghanistan to take down the Taliban? Third issue behind the global recession in Afghanistan is the fact that there are 2 countries, I'd say they're outlaw countries, Iran in the Middle East and North Korea in Asia, that are subverting the entire international system, trying to become nuclear weapons powers. I'll talk about Iran in a minute, because Steve and I are pledged to talk about the Middle East. A word about North Korea. Do you feel comfortable with a nuclear weapons power called North Korea, run by a 28-year-old previously unemployed third son with no management experience? Because when Kim Jong-il died, his 28-year-old son, Kim Jong-un, the third son, who was not supposed to take over, but the other 2 had deficiencies that didn't allow them to be promoted. He now owns a nuclear weapons program. He possesses nuclear weapons in the most militaristic society, and I would say fanatical society, in terms of their ideology on Earth. And they're threatening Japan, our ally, and South Korea, our ally, and they're threatening the United States of America because we still have 37,000 troops just south of North Korea, south of the demilitarized zone in South Korea itself. So global recession, Iran and North Korea running amok, and think what follows that in the inbox. The fact that the Europeans are in crisis. And I'm amazed to see this story on the inside pages of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post. You've got to search to find stories about the Euro debt crisis. But think about that for a minute. This is the place where the greatest number of American allies in the world are. 26 European countries are our treaty allies in NATO. And it's the place, the European Union is the largest trading partner of the United States. Not China, not India, not Brazil. The European Union is the largest trading partner of the United States. They buy more of our products and we buy more of theirs. The European Union is the largest investor in the United States in terms of capital investment in our markets, our bond markets, in our companies. So what happens there really matters to Americans. And yet it's as if we're letting the Europeans float through this crisis. If they don't corral the problems that they have in Greece, the Greek economy is going to contract by 7% this year. Spain and Italy are in financial and budgetary crisis on the ropes as we speak. Will they slip out of control? And if the European Union goes into a double-dip recession, Professor Bluestone would be better placed to answer the question than I would, but I would say it might knock a percentage or 2 off our own GDP growth rate. It might knock us away from our own recovery in 2013 or 14. So boy, it matters what happens there. It matters how we respond to this and whether we can reach out and be of some help to the European governments. What else is in the inbox? The Arab revolutions. That's the subject of tonight's talk by Steve and me, and I'll leave that for just a minute. So think about this. Global recession, the war in Afghanistan, Iran Iran and North Korea, the Euro debt crisis, the Middle East revolutions, and I haven't even gotten to the heart of the international agenda yet. Because the heart of the agenda, as I experienced it as a diplomat, particularly in the latter part of my career, and as I reflect on it now as a professor, are the transnational issues. These are the issues that flow right through our borders, over our borders and under them, where the Atlantic and Pacific can no longer protect us from the ills of the world. And they're the issues that unite in the first globalized society in human history, our society, our global integrated society, unite 7 billion people in 193 countries. And it really matters how America reacts to them and whether or not we lead. Global climate change. Now, I don't suppose there are a lot of people in this audience who are part of the deniers. Climate change doesn't exist, it's just a figment, it's scare tactics, we can go on burning dirty coal. We can just keep driving gas guzzlers. We can be energy inefficient and escape environmental catastrophe. I noticed in the Republican convention in August in Tampa, there were a lot of jokes from some of the politicians from the dais about the concern that the president has shown about global climate change. It's real. The 1,200 scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say it's real. The deniers are in the minority and they're discredited. And so we've got to do something about it. And think about climate change, think about drug cartels that are in every city in America and every major city around the world, these major global cartels bringing drugs into our societies. And we're the consumers, and they provide, the supply. Think about crime cartels that also are highly organized. Conventional crime or cyber crime. The fact that now we've got to worry about the integrity of our personal information, our financial information on our laptops. Every company in America has to worry about the integrity of their intellectual product because they're organized cyber criminal rings stealing information from millions of computers. Think about the fact that women and children are being trafficked in human trafficking, criminal rings all around the world. This is all part of the non-virtuous part of our globalized society. And then think of the really nightmare scenario. I'm sorry to give you all this bad news, but it's the agenda our president's going to face. Think of what happened to us on 9/11 and the juxtaposition of terrorism and the evil of terrorism with weapons of mass destruction. On 9/11, Al-Qaeda chose to use the most crude and conventional tactics possible. They flew airplanes into buildings to kill people. And it was the crash, it was the explosion, it was the falling buildings, it was the fire that killed people. And we lost 3,000 people from many countries in Manhattan, Wall Street, as well as in Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 crashed, as well as at the Pentagon. What if Al-Qaeda had used chemical weapons or biological weapons or nuclear suitcase bomb technology? It's all available for terrorist groups to use against us. If Al-Qaeda had used chemical weapons in lower Manhattan, they would have killed multiples of 3,000 people. If they'd used biological weapons, or God forbid a nuclear suitcase bomb, they could have killed 300,000 people. And that's not an exaggeration in Manhattan and in northern New Jersey. So the consequences for us of globalization, and this is the dark side of globalization, as Tom Friedman calls it, are really important. It's important that we have a president who can look at this unbelievably daunting and forbidding agenda and be smart and rational and sophisticated, have a sense of history, have a sense of how to mobilize people in countries around the world to face these problems. That's what this inbox represents to me when I think about the election. Foreign policy shouldn't be an afterthought for the American people as we choose our president on November 6th. It's got to be, I think, central to our concerns because the issues I've mentioned, well, they affect every single person in this room and every one of us, 305 million people in this country. Now, there's also a very positive side of globalization. You all know what it is, the incredible breakthroughs of medical science and cancer research. The breakthroughs we're making, particularly China and India, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I always tell my students at the Kennedy School, You know, when you leave academia, you go out in the world, you're not just going out to a forbidding, dark, sinister place. There are all sorts of great positive things you can do, particularly in marrying technology and, you know, intellectual growth and innovation to human problems. But we've also got to have our eyes on this agenda that our president meets every day. Now, how about the Middle East? It's interesting. The Obama administration has been saying consistently, and I think correctly, since they came into office, and they've been quoted on this, something along the following lines. Our fundamental problem, they say, is that we're over-invested in the Middle East, and we're under-invested in Asia. And what they mean by that is, there's no question that the great strategic challenges of the future are going to be in Asia, because that's where China is, fastest rising power in the world, and India, our democratic partner. And that's where the Southeast Asian nations are growing economically and in political importance and military importance. Countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam, our former foe now turned friend of 70 million dynamic people out competing the Chinese right now in many ways. So Asia is critical. But the administration can't quite get to Asia as a central focus because we've got so many problems in the Middle East. And we're tied down in the Middle East. And Steve and I will just go through some of those problems. First for me is the war in Afghanistan. I've told you how central it is in the greater Middle East that we figure out a strategy to get out of that war. I'm a former diplomat. I teach diplomacy at the Kennedy School. I understand that diplomacy is not the answer for every question bedeviling us internationally. I understand that sometimes we have to fight. We always have to be strong. We've got to have a strong military. We honor our military. But I also know that the military cannot be applied, military force, to resolve many human problems. That the vast percentage of activities under the rubric international politics are civilian. It's negotiations, it's trade, it's commerce, it's trying to get your way, you know, by outwitting your foe, or by, in a virtuous way, combining force with other countries to do a good thing. That's what diplomacy is all about. We practice it well in this country. But the military can't be the answer to all of our questions. And I think we've come to the end of the line in Afghanistan in terms of what our military can do. Our troops have served there valiantly. We have, I think, 20 national security fellows at the Kennedy School. These are majors and colonels. Nearly all of them have served there. I have 5 of these national security fellows, active duty military officers in my class on modern diplomacy. And it is so interesting and compelling to hear their stories of what they've had to do to protect us in Afghanistan. But I think most of the military leadership that I know in Washington also understands we're not going to be able to fight our way out. There's no conventional victory. This is not going to be like Berlin, 1945. We take the other capital, the flag comes down, they surrender, and we're victorious. And there's a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue or Commonwealth Avenue or Boylston Street in Boston. The war is going to end in a very messy, chaotic way, as Vietnam did. We're going to have to sit down and talk to the enemy. Americans don't like to do that. Look at the political campaign. Some people say, well, it's weak to try diplomacy. Shouldn't talk to your enemies. Shouldn't talk to people who don't think the way we do. But how else are we going to get out of Afghanistan if we don't talk to the Taliban, as well as the Afghan government, as well as the Pakistani government? I think that's what's ahead of us. That's problem number 1 in the Middle East, the greater Middle East. Problem number 2 is Iran. I don't want to sugarcoat this. Iran is a major problem. I think if you ask President Obama, he would say, and probably Governor Romney too, it's the number 1 national security concern for 2013. Because I think both the Democratic Party leadership, certainly President Obama, and the Republican Party leadership agree on one thing. We cannot afford to let Iran become a nuclear weapons power. Their government is too unpredictable, it's too radical, that would be too threatening to the Arab world, to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to the Bahrainis, Kuwaitis, Qataris, and Omanis, certainly to the state of Israel, and also to America and our interests in the greater Middle East. Iran's a difficult government. It's the number 1 funder of terrorism groups in the Middle East. It has been absolutely unhelpful to us over the last decade in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. And there is no question about it, and there is no argument about this across the world. It is trying to become a nuclear weapons power. And we've got to stop that. Now, how should we do that? Well, I think we do have a bipartisan agreement. worked for President Bush as a career diplomat from 2005 to 2008, and I was one of the people centrally involved in the Iran policy. And our policy back then was the same as President Obama's now. We should seek to negotiate with Iran, negotiate our differences if we can. Number one. If they won't come to the negotiating table, and they have refused to come to the table from 2006 on, under both President Obama and President Bush, then we're going to have to sanction them. I helped to negotiate 3 UN Security Council sanctions resolutions. President Obama's gone way beyond where President Bush was. Much tougher policy. We put central bank sanctions and very stringent American financial sanctions on the Iranians. The EU has an oil embargo on Iran, so that now Iran is exporting 1 million barrels a day of oil less than they did a year ago today. And their currency, the rial, has lost 40% of its value in the last month and 80% of its value in the last year, because Iran is being isolated because of its nuclear program. So I would say that this policy of trying to negotiate, sanctioning where we must, and as an ultimate last resort, being prepared to use military force is the correct policy. Now, what's interesting is, if you talk to most Democrats and most Republicans, they agree in this policy. But there are some people saying, well, we can't trust the Iranians, and we can't negotiate with the Iranians, so we ought to go to military force sooner on this continuum. And I think that's dead wrong, and would be a catastrophic mistake for us. Let me tell you something about negotiations. We haven't had a strategic, sustained discussion with the Iranian government in 32 years, since the Jimmy Carter administration. We have been absolutely separated and divorced from them. There hasn't been an American embassy there since the hostages left when they were liberated on January 20th, 1981. No diplomatic contact between the two governments. We haven't had American business people there in years, and American journalists find it very difficult to get visas, although they get in from time to time. There is no contact. Does it make sense to go to war with a country, a government, that you literally don't know? You've never had a discussion with them about this nuclear issue face-to-face, direct talks. It makes no sense to me. In fact, I think it would be unconscionable for us to launch perhaps a third big war in the Middle East without relying on diplomacy first and seeing if diplomacy might resolve the problem. And President Obama has committed himself to diplomacy. And George W. Bush did as well. A lot of people don't realize that in his second term. And so when I hear people saying, well, we can't trust diplomacy, and we got to think about military force now, or in the next few months, or encourage Israel to attack, which I think would be a major mistake, I try to remind them, we haven't even gotten to the negotiating table yet. Not a single leader in our country, Republican or Democratic Party, who served in a high positions, president, vice president, secretary of state, secretary of defense, undersecretary of state, that was the rank I held in the last administration, has ever negotiated with an Iranian official on this issue. So what I hope will happen after November 6th, after our election, is that President Obama, if he's elected, and I hope he will be elected, or Governor Romney, if we elect him, will decide that we're going to suspend consideration of the use of force and spend most of 2013, because we do have the time before Iran becomes a nuclear weapon, to negotiate. And it won't be pretty and easy, and I'm sure it'll be difficult and frustrating. I'm not talking about a day or two. I'm talking about months of negotiation to see if there's some deal that we can make that leaves them short of a nuclear weapon, right? But a deal where we do a little compromising ourselves, because Yitzhak Rabin, very conservative Israeli leader, said you don't negotiate with your best friend. You negotiate with your very unsavory enemies. His words, not mine. And that's what diplomacy, high-stakes diplomacy, is all about. I think that's the path where President Obama would take us. I think it's the right path for our country. I hope that's where we go on the subject of Iran. 2 more thoughts, and I'm going to stand down and listen to Steve. We also have to be very mindful of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's been 64 years now, 64 and a half, since May 14, 1948. That was the day that Israel declared its existence. It came into being in a torturous way, because it was attacked by 5 million neighbors that day. And in those 64 and a half years, the Israelis haven't had a single day of peace. And we ought to try to help the Israelis get that final, permanent peace. But it's also true in those 64 and a half years that the Palestinians haven't had a single day of justice. And they've been denied a homeland, they've lived under occupation, and it's a tough life. Libby and I lived in East Jerusalem in a Palestinian neighborhood for 2 years in the 1980s, Sheikh Jarrah. I spent a lot of time in the refugee camps of the West Bank, saw the conditions in which the Palestinians have to live. These are bright, ambitious, family-oriented people who believe in education, who want to just live a good life. They're a lot like Americans, the Palestinians. And they deserve better from us as well as from the Israelis. So, despite my support for President Obama, I would have to say that one of the significant setbacks he has had as president is that we haven't made any progress on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations since 2009 when he first tried. They've been dead in the water, and I hope after this election we'll go back to thinking that the United States has to push this process forward for peace in the Middle East. It's the right thing for Israel, and it's certainly the right thing for the Palestinians. My last point would be to just make a comment on the Arab revolutions. We're now, 20 months into the Arab revolutions that began with so much extraordinary hope in Tahrir Square, in Cairo, in Pearl Square, in Manama, in Bahrain. To see those young kids take to the streets of Tunis peacefully and bring down a dictator in Tunisia. And a lot of good has happened, and I think we have to acknowledge that. A lot of good has happened. We've seen 4 dictators overthrown by their own people. We've seen free elections in Libya and a moderate government elected there. A free election in Tunisia and a moderate government elected there. A free election in Egypt, the heart and soul of the Middle East, the keystone country, the dominant country. And a government, the Muslim Brotherhood government, emerged that is keeping the peace with Israel, is acting in a democratic fashion in its own country. That disagrees with us on a lot of issues, but is in many ways an improvement over the autocratic regime that reigned there. 3 generals, Nasser and Sadat and Mubarak, since the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. So those are the positive signs that we see. We've also seen tragedy and chaos and brutality and war. We've seen peaceful protesters, Shia protesters in Bahrain, arrested and some of them executed by their own government just for protesting. We've seen Shia in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia demonstrate in far greater numbers than ever before. And most of all, we've seen in Syria this absolutely abject tragedy. Nearly 30,000 civilians have been killed in the last 16 months in Syria. And here's the problem. There's no end in sight for this civil war. The opposition, the inchoate kind of group of rebel armies, not really united, are just not quite strong enough to dislodge Bashar al-Assad. And Assad is just strong enough to stay in power. Unless something happens, unless the international community mobilizes itself, this civil war is likely to go on for some time. We have a real expert here. Rami's here. And he's a fellow in our program, and he maybe will ask a question or say his piece after we talk. But I would think the danger is, Rami, that war will go on for a long time. If it goes on for longer, if 50 or 60 or 70,000 people die, civilians, innocent people, don't we have to ask ourselves the question, what are our responsibilities here? Nobody wants to send in an American land invasion with several 100,000 troops. We've tried occupying Arab countries and Muslim countries. We know what happens. It doesn't end well. But if we had enacted a no-flight zone, took away the air power of the Syrian government, if we helped the Turkish government to give greater assistance to the rebel forces and the Saudi government, and the Qatari government as they do that, if we put a lot more pressure on Assad to bring him down, to get him to resign or throw him out, then we might staunch the real problem, the risk of a wider war with chemical weapons there. This is a war that could spread into Iraq, Jordan, and Syria, with unpredictable consequences for the Middle East. So we've seen positive things in the Arab revolutions, and we've seen negative things. How should we think about our obligations and interests in the Middle East revolutions? I think President Obama has had a very complex set of responses to it, largely correct. What has he done? I tell my students, the way I pictured him from January 2011 to now, responding to the Middle East is, he's in a big stadium, he's up on a high wire, no net below him, juggling, spotlight on him, juggling these competing priorities. On the one hand, we're Jefferson's America. We're the America of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. We're Martin Luther King's America. If there are young people in the Middle East arguing that they should have a democratic future, we've got to support them. And so when President Obama decided we would disavow President Mubarak, and he swung our support to these kids in Tahrir Square, a lot of the realists, a lot of the older generation say, well, this is risky. What are we going to buy? What are we going to get? But he did the right thing to express American values, and it hasn't worked out badly. And when he supported the revolutionaries in Tunisia and Libya, the same thing. He used our air power to bring down Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. But at the same time, the president has not supported revolution everywhere. He didn't support revolution in Bahrain. He's not supported a reform movement in Saudi Arabia because we've got other American interests that we have to balance with our values. The flow of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz to Europe and East Asia. The fact that some of those Gulf regimes, the monarchies of the Gulf, Kuwait, right, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they're our partners in containing Iran. They're our partners in trying to defeat Al-Qaeda. So can you imagine the difficulty if you're the President of the United States, President Obama, and you've got 22 Arab countries on the map in front of you, each one in the midst of a deeply seated social and political revolution. And they're all traveling at different speeds. They all have different characteristics in terms of their revolutions. They all need something from us. And a lot of people said that the president's not being inconsistent. He should either support democracy everywhere, support every reform movement, or we ought to be on the side of the status quo, the old dictators. And frankly, for me, as someone who served in government and see the terrible choices that our presidents and secretaries of state and defense have to make, how difficult they are, I think he's done extraordinarily well on that tightrope. Now, he hasn't gotten everything right. But in the main, the United States has stood up for democracy and freedom when it really counted in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya. And frankly, I think we probably protected some of our real strong security interests in the Gulf, and there's no prospect of a big reform effort in the Gulf at the present time. We don't stop telling the Saudis they ought to let women have full rights. We don't stop telling the Kuwaitis that they ought to give full freedom to their peoples. That's our obligation. But it's not our obligation to bring them down if there's no revolutionary movement right in front of them. So I think the president has made the right calls here. But here's the problem for President Obama in his second term or President Romney in his first. The Arab peoples might be just at the end of Act 1 of a 5-act play, and that play might not conclude for 25, 30, or 40 years. We're looking at one of the great revolutions of our time. And so therefore, we're going to have to be focused on this, we're going to have to be engaged, and we're going to have to really figure out how to balance these competing American objectives in the Middle East. This is hard business ahead of us. And I guess I conclude with a hope. To try to end on a slightly positive note after all these crashes. We're still the world leader. There's so much talk at our universities about the rise of China, the rise of Brazil and India. They're rising to power. But they are not ready to occupy positions of power by their own admission. They don't want to lead. And we're still politically, economically, and militarily the world leader. And we live in a globalized world. So if our reaction to problems overseas is, pull down the shades and pull the covers over our heads or dig the moat around the country deeper and pull up the drawbridges. And we've got isolationists in this country. On the extreme right, and the Tea Party is certainly isolationist, and the extreme left. That is a disastrous policy for the United States. It made, I guess, rational sense in 1812. You might have been able to argue the case in 1912 all over the stretch. You can't argue it in 2012 when we live. We're adrift on a little boat with 7 billion other people. In the era of globalization, everything that happens to them affects us and vice versa. So we've got to lead. Resist isolationism. Resist unilateralism. We tried that about 10 years ago, just after 9/11. Did not work out for our country. We have to lead purposely with allies and friends and bring people together to resolve these really difficult problems. So that's what I wanted to say tonight. We're looking forward to your questions, comments, but you're in for a real treat to hear Steve Kinzer talk about these very same issues. Thank you very much.